Also pose questions to us on the show tonight. The number is 076 656 5353. The number once again 076 656 5353. And I would be delighted to take those questions to the panelists tonight on the show. On to my immediate right, we have Nadim Majid. On to my immediate left, we have Sandro joining us this evening on Face the Nation to pose questions to our panelists. So let's get the ball rolling with Mr. M.A. Sumandaran, President's Council, Member of Parliament representing the TNA. What are your thoughts on the bill that is supposed to be tabled in Parliament on the 25th of April?
It's a twist of irony that bill titled Antiterrorism bill has been gazetted and due to be presented to Parliament. I say twist of irony because it comes on the promise of repealing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, perhaps the most draconian of all laws that we have extant in our statute books today. In 2017, then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe traveled to Brussels and gave an undertaking that the Prevention of Terrorism Act would be repealed and another law that accords with international human rights standards would replace it. He did that because we had by then lost the GSP plus tax concession, and in order to regain it, this promise was given, and we did get it back purely based on that promise. But to this day, PTA is still on our statute books. So, as though to keep that promise at least now, to repeal the PTA, a step has been taken, or so it seems. But the law that is brought to replace it is worse than the one that we have. So it's a case of from the frying pan into the fire. Of course, the government's propaganda is that, well, if you don't want this, you will have to continue to live with the PTA. The horrors of PTA are well documented. If necessary, we can go into some of those aspects. But the proposed law is far, far worse than even the PTA. The broad definition of sorts of terrorism, which enables anything and everything to be brought under the definition of terrorism. Administrative detention, who sanctions those detention, a host of other things, the strengthening of the executive president's powers, all of that make this a law that is that has been designed with what might happen in the future in the country. Because if you just take a look back at the last year, 2022, there were a series of events that happened in the country, and many of the aspects that are being introduced through the anti-terrorism bill seems to have been designed to meet with such eventualities if it were to happen again.
Very quickly, Mr. Sumandaran, I want to understand your party's position on this bill in question.
Yeah, we are opposed to it. We were opposed to the PTA for a long, long time. In fact, for 2 years now, we've carried on a campaign right through the country to repeal the PTA. And we've had a fair amount of support right through the country for that. But this law is, worse than the PTA, as I said.
But it seems that in 2018, you all supported the counter-terrorism bill.
We did not support it. It was never presented to Parliament.
Yeah, but you all...
we participated in the discussions, and when it was presented, I was the first person to say that even that first draft was worse than the PTA. I've gone on public record saying that. But thereafter, there was a parliamentary committee that went into it. There were a series of discussions, and a number of issues that we raised were put right. Still there were issues, still there were concerns, and a promise of sorts were given by Mr. Tilak Marapana at that time that at the committee stage those would be addressed. We were not quite satisfied with it, but we were prepared to engage and have them also corrected. But somehow that didn't ever materialize with the Easter bombing that was thrown aside.
Right. Thank you very much, M.A. Sumandaran, President's Council, Member of Parliament representing the TNA. We now move our attention to Mr. Nala Gudeheva, Member of Parliament representing the Freedom People's Front.
Actually, I've seen a lot of discussions around that in the past, and even your last week program was very much on this, going into great detail. But I like to look at a different point of view on this, because whenever I see a bill that has been brought forward by President Ranil Wickremesinghe, or even when he was Prime Minister in several governments, I always look for the motive, because the timing and everything has a motive. It's just not what is the content of the bill. Right now, what is...
Whichever bill it is.
Whatever, but most of them, whatever bill he brings in when he's in power has a motive. It's very timely for the context. So we have to look at the context in which this bill comes forward. Right now, the Sri Lanka is currently going through economic issue that everybody knows. We had a struggle, there was a change of leadership in the country, and then there was all this talk about IMF. Now the IMF first tranche has come. People have started saying that it is going to settle the matters, but at the same time frustrated professionals are protesting, strikes are coming up, and a lot of issues can be expected in time to come. Even though general public think that the economy is now settled, people who understand economy like us know within the next 6 months or whatever, things are going to change drastically, because most of these things that are being presented in the IMF agreement cannot be realistically achieved, which means there will be more and more issues coming up from the people. I think this bill has been timed to suppress any such protest or objection that is coming here, because let me not go into detail of the bill, but look at how this is against the Constitution. Now, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the President, has already challenged several provisions in the Constitution. In our Constitution, when we talk about sovereignty, we talk about three things. First one, the government, executive, legislative and judiciary, then the people's franchise, and fundamental rights, right? Franchise already been challenged. Elections are postponed indefinitely, right? And then we come to fundamental rights, for which there's a complete chapter dedicated in the Constitution. That is what has been challenged by this act. As a citizen, that's how I see this. Because there's one complete chapter in our Constitution, Chapter 3, on fundamental rights. In the fundamental rights, there are a lot of things that have been specified. I think there are good panelists here who can go into greater detail than me. And one such thing is that no person shall be arrested except according to procedure established by law. Now here, if you look at this act, it is not arresting. It's about detention. It's about leaving a lot of room for detention of people. Even IGP can now give orders to detain somebody. So they are going into that extent. Now in the fundamental rights, we talk about the freedom of speech and expression, including publication, the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, freedom to form and join a trade union. All these things, one by one, you can say, challenged by this act. So I see this bill as an attempt to suppress people in time to come, because they are expecting a lot of problems with the economy in the direction the economy is going.
Mr. Gudeheva, when you look at the government, which you were a part of before, individuals in the cabinet seem to be having different views on this particular bill in question. Why is it that the Minister of Justice is trying to push for this bill on the 25th of April?
Obviously, he's part of the government. These people in the government, the people in the cabinet want to continue not only for just another 1.5 years, they want to continue the next term as well. So they want to keep Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe in power. For that, they want to suppress all these potential objections that can come from people.
But Ranil Wickremesinghe is from a different party. Why would they do that?
People are now changed parties. No, if you look at the current parliament, it's a completely distorted parliament. No, what is the party in power? I have no clue as to what the party in power, because most of us have left the government. The people in the cabinet are not from the original SLPP mostly. So the party formulation, the party composition has significantly changed. It's all about finding a leader with whom you can remain in power. That is what these guys are doing.
It seems like that certain cabinet ministers who are with the SLPP have already shown their allegiance towards Ranil Wickremesinghe, so there might be even more things to discuss in the future when it comes to a party composition and who is going to be the common candidate or the candidate for an upcoming election if there's a presidential election that is held in Sri Lanka, isn't it?
Quite possible. Now, if you look at the election from which Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected as president within the parliament, isn't it very surprising that 134 people or parliamentarians voted for him? And these are the very people who were criticizing him not just at one election, but during so many elections for almost 25 years, right? But they suddenly found him very attractive and elected him as president simply because they want to remain in power. They wanted their protection, and that same practice will continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nala Guneheva, Member of Parliament representing the Freedom People's Front. We now move to Shreen Abdul Sarur, activist. Tell us, Shreen, what are your thoughts on this subject tonight?
So as Mr. Subhadran and Mr. Nala Guneheva pointed out, this is more draconian than PTA. The timing is also very important because of the debt restructuring and some of the process that the government will take, drastic measures. People are going to go on the street. So this is going to target those people who are going to resist. And also government from the beginning of the GSP Plus discussion, they've been trying to do some window dressing with regard to PTA. That happened last year. And prior to that, because of 30/1, they brought in CTA, and now they are saying it's for GSP Plus approval. So it's very interesting. They have not even studied what the GSP Plus recommendation and what it requests, because it's based on sustainable development and good governance. And in Sri Lanka, they are bringing in this draconian piece of legislature in order to suppress dissent, people coming onto street talking about, because if we want to get over the crisis, we need people's participation. This particular bill has been drafted without any form of participation of people. And also there have been quite a lot of victims who have suffered under PTA. There have been no victim-centered consultation, right? And there are international standards and practices that has been required by the GSP Plus recommendation as well. And many special rapporteurs and UN bodies have time and time again pointed to Sri Lankan government that how bad PTA has been, and they have come up with a ATA justifying that they need to have this in order to have the GSP Plus intact. It's highly problematic because if we want to recover from economy, we need GSP Plus. We also need economic recovery with the people's participation. I don't see the government intention as such, but the government intention is to repress any form of resistance.
So are you trying to say, Shreen, that this piece of legislation is more draconian than the Prevention of Terrorism Act?
Exactly, yeah.
So this is not a possible replacement at all?
Not at all, because say for one example, they brought in de-radicalization bill some time ago, a year ago. We went to Supreme Court, it's being argued in Supreme Court still, right? Whatever the things that they want to have in de-radicalization, they have incorporated into ATA. In the past, Sri Lankan government, in addition to PTA, they also use Section 3 of the CCPR, which is localized, the governance on civil and political rights, that is being incorporated again in ATA, right? And government loves this rehabilitation idea, because earlier when PTA was when they were using PTA, under the emergency they were able to rehabilitate supposedly LTT members and LTT associates, right? In the post-war context. Then in the post-Easter context, they wanted to rehabilitate 300 odd Muslims who have been taken under PTA, right? And that was not successful. Then they brought in de-radicalization bill, and that is now pending in the Supreme Court. Then they brought in rehabilitation bureau bill, which Supreme Court struck many of the provisions because it didn't comply with the Constitution, and now they have put all of those lumped up things into ATA, where they want to collectively punish people even for thought process.
So you're saying that they are trying to surreptitiously move all this into one document and then bring forth and show their power in Parliament and enact this as a piece of legislation?
Definitely. And then also give more power to the executive and also military plus the police.
Very quickly, Shreen, do you agree with Mr. Godeheva's thoughts that this is being brought in a situation where in 6 to 7 months things are going to be worse? As a result of that, the government would want to suppress the people. As a result of that, they are trying to bring this piece of legislation into play.
Yeah, people are struggling, barely managing 2 or 3 meals in this country because the wage has stagnated, cost of living is increasing. If you look at garment factories and all, women are getting 30,000 monthly salary. The upcountry, the plantation sector, 1,000 rupees is still a dream for them. They are not. It has not materialized. We are sending our workers abroad to send much needed dollars to this country, right? So at some point, the way that the government is going to restructure the economy, there will be, many labor rights will be violated, and also the subsidies will be taken away because we are a welfare state and we are going to privatize a lot of it. How people are managing right now is because of the welfare nature of our state. We have free education, free health, subsidized food, subsidized fertilizer and various other things that is sustaining our people to not to go hunger. So when they restructure all these things and privatize, and even if they touch the EPF and ETF for their restructuring debt purposes, people will come onto the street and they want to suppress that.
All right. Thank you very much, Shreen Abdul Sarur, who's joining us with us on Face the Nation tonight, who is an activist. I now move my attention to Ambika Satgurunathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. What are your thoughts on this subject, Ambika?
Well, I would say this is just one more building block in the web of oppressive laws that the state is constructing. Because now, for instance, we have the Bureau of Rehabilitation bill that Shreen talked about. That actually can be used in conjunction with the ATA. Now, when it was first brought, it could be applicable to everyone, but then they changed it after revised it after the Supreme Court determination, and they made it applicable only to persons with drug dependency. And perhaps because of that, there wasn't much opposition to it. Well, big mistake, huh? Because in that law, which came into effect on the 24th of January of this year, it also has that phrase, that lovely phrase which says, or any other person. Now, there are provisions in the Antiterrorism bill which say that the Attorney General can defer or suspend prosecution, can, not initiate criminal proceedings if the person agrees to go for rehabilitation. But now you can look at that and say, oh, well, this is very good because they can go for rehab. But what we have seen historically, and I'm basing this on evidence, on cases, is that they've often forced people to go to rehabilitation in the past when they haven't had enough evidence to prosecute them. So this is a web that the state is constructing, and I think we must look at it from the point of view of the fact that although the state is supposed to be the protector, it's the duty bearer, it has the duty to protect the rights of the citizen. We have not just the PTA, but there are various other things like drug laws, where the laws are used mainly to circumvent, to undermine and to restrict the rights of the citizen. So I would see it as part of that, and also not just in terms of protest, but we also see journalists can be restricted through this. There are acts like photographing places, sketching places, they're all criminalized, which means you can't also document human rights violations that take place, for instance, at a prohibited place.
So you're trying to say that if a media organization goes and shoots a protest, they could be penalized against
let's
it as
say
well.
they declare a place as a prohibited place and people go and protest in front of that saying this shouldn't be a prohibited place. You go and film that and they can say, well, this is a prohibited place, so why is Sirasa there? Well, great way to get you guys. What about places of detention? Busa, human rights violations, history of it. So if a journalist goes there to try to gather information, they could say that that is potentially you're violating you're gathering information, you're sketching or you're taking photographs, etc. And also if you gather what they call confidential information, right? And with the intent of committing an offense under this law, then that act is also criminalized. What is confidential information? Activities related to law enforcement. So it could even be a policeman brutally beating someone, things that happen at a detention center, which could be violations, things that happen at prohibited places. So as you can see, this law has many provisions, which if you look at it very carefully, they found ways to trap you. And you will not know that you're trapped until they arrest you, detain you, and you ask for the reason, and they will mix and match various sections in this law to trap the person.
Ambika, the way you are portraying this bill to be, because I need to be the devil's advocate, unfortunately, because we don't have a clear government representative on the show tonight. There are some good aspects to the bill as well. Let's talk about Section 24. A woman to be arrested by a woman officer. Let's talk about Section 26 with regard to giving a formal writing before an arrest is being made. Section 32, for another example, the magistrate to visit the person detained under detention order once a week and inquire into their well-being. So good aspects are also covered in this bill in questions. Mr. Sumandran, Mr. Gudeva, Srina, all have the view that this is a piece of draconian law, but there are good aspects to the bill as well.
Absolutely, and I've actually publicly pointed out those good aspects. So it's not like we're denying it, but those are what we call due process rights, which means you should have them anyway, regardless of whether you're being arrested under the PTA or you're being arrested for a drug offense or you're being arrested under the penal code for another offense. So those are general rights, which actually some of them are not already in our law. So you need to include that in the relevant law because we are already entitled to them. You can't put them into a draconian piece of legislation because those protections there don't actually protect us because the other sections undermine the protections.
Well, thank you very much, Ambika Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. You too can join in the conversation. You can pose your questions on 076-656-5353. I've got a few questions lined up to pose to Mr. Gudeva and Mr. Sumandran. I'll pose them to you momentarily as we go along. On to my immediate right again is Nadim. On to my immediate left is Sandro. Let's get the ball rolling with Sandro. Nadim? Yes, Sandro.
Thanks, Shamit. It's an open question, but primarily I want to ask now, with today's topic is about the life. What would life be like with the Prevention of Terrorism bill that is there, that if it is passed? So police, we've seen, as all of you would agree with me, have battered and brutally beaten people for the past many years, especially last year we saw this. TV journalists being beaten on screen, live on TV, and constantly journalists and people being harassed, their right to protest being deterred. Now, the whole problem was with Sri Lanka was that the balance of powers isn't at balance. And with this ATA, what's going to happen is that police are going to be given more powers. So what is life like for an average Sri Lankan if this, on the 25th, if this is passed? What will it be like? Will we see a military rule in Sri Lanka? Because that is what we feel, because DIGs have more powers, and we saw the hints of, I would say, a devolution of powers being passed by the president as well previously, and in a unitary state, mind you, despite the controversy there. So what are your thoughts? Will there be...
Let me pose that question directly to Member of Parliament, President's Council, Mr. Mandiran. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, this law is to replace another law that is already in extant. Under the law that is already there for 44 years, which was brought in just for 6 months initially, we already have that situation. So your question is actually it reveals the fact that the government wants repressive laws in their hands. So when they have given a promise to repeal one, they won't repeal it without replacing it with another, at least with equal powers given to them. But in this we find that far more than what the PTA gives. For instance, the president has legislation making powers almost. He can make rules, he can make regulations, and a host of other things that have been introduced in this. So this is a move towards dictatorship. Police state, yes, to some extent, but this is actually fortifying the executive presidency, which this time last year almost everyone in the country wanted abolished. Right? But somehow they did a 21st Amendment, which was an eyewash, didn't take away any powers of the executive president, but touted it as something that was giving ear to the people's cry to cut down the executive powers of the president. But he is still with that executive power. We can see it on display. Even elections, one of the foundations of democracy, just that one man is able to
Mr. Sumanthiran, on that note, like you notice that with these legislative moves that are being made, Mr. Godeheva spoke about the motivations of Mr. Wickremesinghe's administration in bringing this legislation. If you look back to a lot of the legislation that was passed in the late 70s, early 80s, when the Prevention of Terrorism Act, when the PTA first came in, then you look at the 4th Amendment to the Constitution in 82, which suspended sort of elections, extended the term of Parliament. Again, it was like that setup, that there is a clear, let's say, a causal relationship almost between that sort of unwillingness to listen to the people, which led to one of the bloodiest decades in the country's history, the 80s and leading into the late 80s as well. Do you fear that we're setting ourselves up for more of the same right now?
Yeah, of course. As I mean, we all agree, I think, that the timing is ominous because government is bracing itself for a citizens' uprising and arming themselves with the strongest possible instrument in their hand to suppress it. They don't want any kind of dissent to be expressed. So they know that hard times are coming. And you see, if you just look at what happened last year, you will know this. They tried many things. Declaration of emergency, challenged, court granted leave to proceed. A whole lot of things happened, some of which Ambiha said, Shreen said. They went to court. Actually the rehabilitation regulations, there's an interim order by the Supreme Court stalling it. So they tried many things under the even though the present dispensation allows for a lot of these abuse, still the safeguards were enough to halt many of those.
So Mr. Sumanthiran,
now they are trying to remove all of that.
So Mr. Sumanthiran, I'm no lawyer, but when you read Section 19, Section 20, Section 21, Section 22, Section 49(1), it seems that the government is bracing itself for a state of emergency rather than bringing a state of emergency, which
so this
is
will
now
be a constant state of emergency. You see, otherwise you have to declare a state of emergency, and that needs to be extended month by month. Parliament has to give its approval for that. But here, so it's only under that the president can make regulations, emergency regulations. But here, under a law that will be extended, 24/7, 365 days, the president has powers to make regulations.
What do you think? Because I saw you tweeted on this today as well with regard to having a de facto state of emergency in the country. Do you think the government is trying to bring forth such a law or such an act because they want to control the people, in the country?
Well, I think we already were in a de facto state of emergency because this goes back a very long time, but at least in the the
recent past, we saw Maithripala Sirisena, then we saw Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and then we also saw Ranil Wickremesinghe using Section 12 of the Public Security Ordinance, which, unlike the state of emergency, doesn't have to be debated in Parliament, doesn't have to be voted on. All the President needs to do is just issue a gazette every month and call out the armed forces to maintain public order, and it gives them powers to arrest, etc. So that is a surreptitious way in which the de facto state of emergency has been maintained, but most people did not even know that. Now what they're trying to do is make it legitimize it, and also in a way easier for them. Why bother issuing a gazette every month? We can just make certain things permanent, so we don't have to remember to issue the gazette every month.
And that ruffles a little bit of feathers as far as the international community is concerned as well.
I don't, for us here, yes, of course, the international community need to be concerned, particularly people like the EU, which gives us GSP, but I think we need to be concerned because it affects us. And you have the military being brought in, being given the powers of the police, which only serves to entrench militarization. Would you want an army officer arresting you and keeping you for 24 hours before handing you over to the police, or stopping you somewhere, or seizing your phone, or searching your vehicle? Would you want that? I don't think so, right? So this makes all that legitimate and legalizes it.
Sreen, on the subject of the international community, yesterday there was a letter that was sent to the diplomatic corps by multiple civil society organizations, activists and private citizens as well, and I think you're one of the signatories on that. You cover a lot of what was said here already today, but something else, since we spoke about the courts, something in that statement that popped to me is that you all say in that letter that you do not have faith in the capacity or ability of the Supreme Court to petition the Supreme Court to stop this bill from going through. Why is that?
Primarily because I think when it comes to terrorism, when it's discussed in the court, not only in Supreme Court, any court that I have been, magistrate to judges to Supreme Court judges are very worried about it. It's very difficult to get a breakthrough because here they are framing everything as terrorism, and also in the post-Easter context. To tell you the truth, there is a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment and it's rising up, right? So in that context, it's very difficult for us to get a judgment where we would be able to successful in getting what we exactly want. So that's why we have recommended to get away with the ATA and to immediate moratorium on PTA, and then to think about, if you really want a terrorism offense, define it and then have it in the penal code, so that other measures that
so that you don't need extraordinary laws to deal with it.
Because we already have many laws and like the measures that would.
So Sreen, when we speak about terrorism, what we start wondering is, or the ordinary people would think is LTTE to be terrorists. And then what happened on the 21st of April several years ago, the Easter bombings, terrorism. But here, why is it affecting the ordinary citizen? Why must they be worried? Because the bill itself is anti-terrorism bill. Why must an ordinary citizen be worried about such a bill?
So it's the definition itself is very broad. That's very worrisome for us. This happened in the CTA as well. But we have to go back to the PTA. How PTA has been abused time and time against ethnic minority, particularly the Tamil community, and how they kind of lump up all the people who were surrendering to the Sri Lankan military and sent in for rehabilitation. Many didn't come back. To date, we see mothers on the street asking where their children.
There was no closure.
Yes, right? So they disappeared.
No, Sri,
In the name of terrorism, they took
Sri,
them for rehabilitation.
My question is not that. My question is, why must an ordinary citizen in Sri Lanka be worried about this bill? Because we're talking about an anti-terrorism bill, and it seems like it's very targeted at a certain group, which is not the case with regard to this bill, because you say that this is very broad.
Yeah.
How is it going to affect
No,
the
so that's
normal,
what I'm
citizen?
coming up.
Let's say what happened a few months ago, a year ago in Sri Lanka. Let's say an individual wants to protest against the government. Does that mean they can't be doing it in the future? Is that what this defines?
Yes. So the way that PTA has been abused is a lesson that we have to take into, right?
Yeah, but
because we can't
PTA
forget the past.
Yeah, but PTA was not directly used to detain individuals when it came to...
It has been used against human rights activists,
Yes,
journalists,
absolutely,
average people.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but there were thousands of people who went to the streets, and irrespective of race, color, religion, or whatever it is. So I'm not talking about only a certain section of the community. I'm talking about how will it affect an ordinary citizen, because Mr. Godeheva says 7 to 8 months down the line, people are going to protest again because things are going to be difficult. You said the same thing as well. Mr. Sumandran was also of the same view. So when all three of you are of the same view that things are going to be difficult and people are going to go to the streets once again, how is it going to affect that person? Would that person who goes onto the street for the very first time, would he be arrested under this law?
Definitely. So the law, the way that they have defined association, that even if I had a knowledge of somebody going against government, say trade union having a meeting, right, about some form of privatization, I have the information even though if I have not participated, purely because I started sending that message to other people to take part in it. Those people will be arrested.
Yeah, because when we speak about a protest, or when we speak about a movement, it starts from an individual. That's what I'm asking you very directly. Would that individual who is protesting against the government's way in which they are operating, can he be arrested under this law?
Definitely. And also, like, very interestingly in this, that people have to think about it, because freedom of association, assembly is completely curtailed.
Absolutely. So what about that? Because I thought, Mr. Sumandran, that the Constitution supersedes these acts that are enacted. Isn't it so? Freedom of expression, freedom of association is a constitutional right.
Yeah, but some of these rights in the Constitution under Article 15(7) can be restricted in its operation. So freedom of association, all of that come under that. So if you pass it as a law, to that extent, the exercise of that right can be curtailed.
It could be curtailed.
That's what the Constitution itself says. So we have a bad Constitution to start with. We have a terrible Constitution to start with. So that answers the question that you posed to Shrina as well. So the Supreme Court has to see whether this is unconstitutional. That's a very limited.
But that's a very limited scope.
Very limited scope.
Yeah.
So that also we will do. But here is a situation of not merely looking at the nitty-gritties and technicalities of whether it accords with this provision of the Constitution or it violates the other and such. This is far more with the hindsight of knowledge that we have from the PTA itself. Did the PTA prevent a 30-year war? It's called Prevention of Terrorism Act, for God's sake. Right? It did not prevent it. Did it prevent the Easter bombing? No, it did not. Actually, if you even look a cursory look at how it has functioned, it has promoted all of these things. It has been counterproductive.
Dr. Godeheva, we see that with a lot of at the end of the day, even with, let's say, the ICCPR law that was brought in under the Yahapalana administration, it's really with the people who are charged with enforcing these laws as well, right? How they interpret it, how they do it. So I want to draw your attention to in February, at the Supreme Court itself, Justice Aluwihara gave a glaring indictment of the Sri Lanka police. This is to do with custodial deaths. He says, I'll quote from that, Sri Lanka police, established in 1806, has a history of over 2 centuries. One would expect it to develop into a body that comprises of professional law enforcement personnel. I am at a loss to understand in the present day and time as to why such an established law enforcement entity is incapable of affording due protection to a citizen who is in their custody. Unfortunately, it is not rare to hear instances of suspects dying in the hands of the police. It only highlights the utterly unprofessional approach to duty by the personnel who man it, and as a consequence, people are increasingly losing trust in the police. And I think it's fair to say that people have lost trust in law enforcement. In this context, do we need, what is the position of your party, the Freedom, the current alliance that you are with, the grouping in Parliament, your parliamentary group? What is your stand as far as anti-terrorism legislation? Are you all pro-PTA? Do you all prefer the counter-terrorism bill that was proposed under Yapalna administration? Do you prefer the current do you think we need anti-terrorism legislation at all? Do you think the current penal code is sufficient?
See, at the very beginning, I was talking about abusing the law to continue to be in power. Yapalna government was a classic example, and because you mentioned about police, you know, the unprofessionalism was police was very much evident during the Yapalna government. Look at the anti-corruption unit that was set up by the Yapalna government. How many people were arrested under that? How many people were kept in remand under that? How many people were indicted, and what is the final result? And today, we have found most of those things were politically motivated, and the police was doing what their bosses wanted, the political bosses wanted. So even in future, that is exactly what will happen. When you give more powers to the police, it's going to get worse. Now, it's not only the president now today under this act, a DIG can detain somebody, and for that, all he needs is some instructions from political boss.
But Dr. Gureva, it's interesting that you say that, like you're talking about how under political leadership, the police has been used as an instrument of political power, to show political force, for political witch hunts. But then your party, that you proposed, you voted for, your campaign for the 20th Amendment, which sort of decreased the independence of these institutions. A lot of those people are in Parliament. It's the same Parliament that passed the 20th Amendment that is still, that is trying to decide on this anti-terrorism legislation as well. So it's a parliament that doesn't have the people's mandate anymore, that is trying to pass legislation that will have very far-reaching consequences. So I'm trying to understand how MPs come to these decisions, right? You believe that the politicization of the police is a bad thing, but then you all have also voted for legislation that politicizes the police even more.
Yeah. See, what you have to understand is when it comes to voting in the parliament, usually the MPs are instructed in certain specific bills how they should vote. It's a decision of the party. So if you go against that, you have to leave the party, and the parliamentary seat you can lose that. But that is why it came to a point that we even left the party. We could agree. We could agree with what was happening. And if you look at, since you mentioned about 20th Amendment, remember, yes, 20th Amendment was supported, but at the same time we supported 21st Amendment, diluting some of those powers that were given. Then thereafter, when President Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected president, SLPP wanted us to support the emergency law, and 6 of us protested and we voted against. So that's the point at which we decided that we will become independent. I think the parliamentarians must act like that.
So, Dr. Gureva, when you look at the matters or issues that have been unraveling in Sri Lanka over the last few months, last few weeks, especially relating to the IMF, everyone was of the opinion that an anti-corruption piece of legislation would be first tabled in Parliament because that's the need of the hour. Aren't you surprised that this government is trying to bring in this piece of legislation prior to bring in anti-corruption piece of legislation, which is the need of the hour in terms of the IMF requirement as well?
Definitely. I mean, if you ask me, what is the main cause of our economic crisis that we are facing today, I would say for the last 75 years, the way we have managed government affairs, and particularly the huge corruption that entailed in that, was one of the primary reasons why we are in this situation today. So definitely anti-corruption has to be a priority, but then, as I mentioned earlier, anti-corruption has to be not politically abused. It has to be specific to control corruption. We will definitely support if there's a good piece of legislation is being brought forward. But when it comes to this piece of legislation, as I mentioned earlier, here the motive is definitely
because right now the order of the day is good governance, anti-corruption. These are the matters that need to be discussed in Parliament. Individuals like MP Sumandran, individuals in your caliber, Dr. Nala Gudeva, you all have to be talking about this, not talk about a piece of legislation that is going to be so draconian that people won't be able to even survive. And
no, we are talking about that. We are talking about good governance, but unfortunately, the term good governance in single translation, Yahaparana, has a bad taste in the country because the word itself was abused. Yeah. But definitely, good governance is definitely the need of the day, I would say, if you want to change
so
things.
Ambika, I just want to pick your brain on this, the detention orders. Now, the PTA requires the DO to be issued by the Minister of Defence under Section 31 of the bill. Now, this bill in question says that the Deputy Inspector General of Police has the power to issue a DO if he is satisfied of the existence of reasonable grounds to believe that the suspect has committed or has concern in committing an offence under the Act. Does that mean that the 50 DIGs in Sri Lanka can issue the detention order?
Yes, before I come to that, I'd like to go back to two issues that you raised. You wanted an example of how an ordinary citizen would be affected. Simple thing. Someone puts up a post on Facebook asking people to gather to protest against something, right? And maybe the person putting up the post is a government employee and they're calling union members to come and the public to come to support it. That falls within the intention. The definition of terrorism has two sections. One is an intention and then acts. If you commit those acts with that intention, it becomes terrorism. So the intention, one of the intentions is compelling a government to do something or to abstain from doing something. And one of the acts is interference with essential services. And the president can very easily declare something an essential service by merely issuing a gazette. So let's say if it's like, postal workers or railway workers or teachers, then they declare that an essential service. Calling them to protest to compel the government to do or not to do something would constitute terrorism. So that is how your question about the ordinary citizen can be affected. And also in relation to the Supreme Court, we must remember that the CTA went before the Supreme Court. It was challenged in 2018. And if you look at the Supreme Court determination, many of the things that we say are problematic now, the Supreme Court actually didn't find it was problematic. So which means at that time. So if we go back again, like, we said, certain things, as I said, the ATA is about 80% the CTA, at least the CTA that was tabled, the bill. And
Mr. Mandran said that the bill...
He was talking about committee stage. Maybe they changed it, but I'm talking about the bill that they had.
That was published.
That was published. I'm talking about the document in the public domain. Right. He's probably talking about something that was not in the public domain. So if you look at that, 80% of CTA is ATA. And even in that, one of the things that was the executive or the police...
Just hold on for a second, Ambika. If it's 80%, Mrs. Mandran, it's not bad, no?
What do you mean it's not bad?
I'm picking your brain on that.
No. When the CTA was published, as I said earlier, I said it was worse than the PTA.
You said it was worse.
Yeah, I publicly said it was worse than the PTA. Right?
But it seemed like at that time, the DNA was okay. Yeah.
No. Thereafter, 3 members of the drafting committee gave dissenting reports, and the parliamentary committee summoned them and found that what they were saying was right. So all of that was changed. And then the EU ambassador actually came to Parliament and attended these committees. And an Attorney General's Department official had to go to Brussels and get clearance and so on. So a lot of work was done thereafter. One point just to add to what Ambika says about the Supreme Court determination, CTA did not have death penalty, but the Supreme Court said you must have death penalty. So Supreme Court did one worse than what the drafters did. And now they have put it in the ATA.
Yeah, they mentioned that in the
But
ATS.
also one of the most concerning things that, I mean, for us, we would say, you know, judicial authority should not be usurped by the executive or the police. And that was there in the CTA, it's there in the ATA, but the Supreme Court itself did not find that problematic. So we thought they would find it, you know, their authority being undermined problematic.
Right.
So your question, but yes, the DIGs, coming back to the detention orders, yes. They can actually. So you have not one, but right now I think there are 50. Not all cadre positions are filled, but
63.
I think the active are 50. There are 63 must be cadre positions. So 50 DIGs, yes, they can issue. So right now we have one person issuing it, and even when the Minister of Defense issues it, we have so much, you know, so many problems in, you know, whether you get a copy of it and whether it has been issued,
and there can be instances where individuals can be issued with detention orders because the DIG is biased as
Absolutely.
well.
And the point is, you should not have someone at the rank of DIG with no judicial oversight having the power to detain someone, detain you, detain me for possibly 3 months. Up to initial detention is 3 months and then up to a year. And the magistrate at that point, they present, so what they've done is, it appears, oh, they're presenting the detention order to the magistrate, but the magistrate has the power only to give effect to it, not to actually decide whether the detention order should be issued or not. And even thereafter, when they go to extend it, they have to file it's a confidential report. 2, the proceedings are in camera, which means, you know, journalists can't go to monitor it. And 3, if the judge decides that there is no evidence to detain the person, the judge must ask, the word used is shall, not may, must ask whether there are reasons to remand the person. Now, any rational person would wonder, if there's no reason to detain you on a detention order, how can there be a reason to remand you in prison? But apparently there is. And if they find that there is no reason to remand, then you would think that the judge can discharge you, which means they can completely release you. Or no, they can't. They have the power to only give you bail, which means you're still stuck in the legal process. So what the law does, it tries its maximum to ensure that the person just doesn't, you know, get out, even if there is no evidence, and they've limited the powers and the discretionary powers of the magistrate. So you do have the police are the ones exercising, or the, you know, the executive.
So when you look at Section 55 also, Ambika, it's very clear that it allows a police officer without a judicial order to take over the control of a vehicle, vessel, train, aircraft or unmanned aerial vehicle.
That's
for
right.
the purpose of conducting an investigation or for preventing the commission of an offence as well. So
that's right. That existed in the CTA as well, by the way. And of course, that doesn't mention the rank of the police officer, which means, I think what I said is, it can even be like a constable, right? Comes and takes over your car and says, I want to investigate, get out, and seizes it. So yes, that's a problem.
But even now, Ambika, when you go on the roads, when the police want to check your vehicle, you have to allow them to do so, right, Mr. Mandira?
Yeah, well, you can allow them to check the vehicle, but they must have a reasonable suspicion to stop and search your vehicle. Even to stop the vehicle, there must be reasonable suspicion. You can't just do a random stop and check.
But Mrs. Mandran, how do you, like we were talking about defining, right? You have to define what terrorism is. How do you define what a reasonable suspicion is? What is a reasonable suspicion?
A reasonable suspicion is if a police have got information that a car is transporting something, and you know, it's coming at this time, at this speed, you know, so then that's
like, for example, I give you so you're going in a 3-wheeler down Marine Drive, you're wearing a flowery beach shirt and a pair of shorts and a cap, and then the police stops you and they want to search you because they believe that they suspect that you might be carrying drugs. Is that a reasonable suspicion?
No, that's not a reasonable.
It's not.
That's not a, that is not a
really
reasonable suspicion. No.
So, I mean, so these are the kinds of things that happen to you. Asking about ordinary people. These are the kinds of things that happen to ordinary people.
Decided case that is reported, Rodrigo versus somebody or the other by Sarath Silva CJ, that says if you are stopped and asked to get off the vehicle, that's an arrest.
They can't ask you to get down from
Ms. Shrina, what would the ideal anti-terrorism law look like in your perspective?
To begin with, I mean, the problem after the Easter attack whether we like it or not, we need to deal with this issue. So we need to have a definition of what is terrorism. And as I mentioned previously, our penal code can accommodate so that the other sections in the penal code, the protection that is being assured for the suspects can kick in, right? Because these anti-terror laws comes in with also, you have to also keep in mind that Sri Lankan criminal justice system itself is a problem for us because we are dealing with a criminal justice system that has penalized people for 10-15 years without even charging them. They have been in prison under the PTA, right? So we need to be very mindful that we have to define it very narrowly and to couch it such a way that the people will have every measures possible, and judicial oversight is very important, and make sure that it is law and order issue, because bringing in military and rehabilitation and then president using his power and then now DIG is using their power to punish a person without even any charges. We have been dealing with, at the community level, there are many innocent people who have not even committed anything, and there has been no charges. They have been on bail, but like the bail conditions are very severe, right? So that's why it's very important that we narrowly define terrorism and couch it within the penal code.
And these people, these rural people from the rural areas, were not the, I would say, the start of the Aragale, because if I may, Aragale was the brainchild of the urban communities coming together, because that was their last straw. So Dr. Gudeva, I'd like to ask you now, you were in the government last year when this was going on, and when you were appointed as the Minister of Mass Media, was, if I'm not mistaken, around the time when then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe had just come in and had also issued a commission, or a committee rather, to protect the Aragale site, the Gotagogama site. So we were talking about holding on to power. You mentioned that specifically, and the changing of laws depending on how you want it. A president who wanted to protect the site at the time, when he became ascended to president, then chose to do the opposite. Now he's playing a major role in bringing in an act that is going to do the exact opposite of what he did back then. You were in the cabinet even while this was going on, before you resigned, in the party that you were in the party as well. So what are your thoughts on, can the people trust a leader that is not constitutional and at the same time who changes his mind?
Yeah, first of all, a couple of timings are wrong. Yeah. I was appointed into the cabinet as Minister of Mass Media by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa when he changed the cabinet and brought a lot of young and new people. But I immediately resigned. On his request, I stayed for about 2 weeks, and then I resigned once again. Mr. Ranil
You hand over your resignation, they didn't accept it.
They didn't accept. He requested me to stay on till the cabinet is dissolved.
Yeah, right? but you still remained as
I remained. I remained for about 1.5 weeks. Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed Prime Minister after that. When he was appointed Prime Minister, I was not in the cabinet. Right? That was on the 11th of May, if I remember, and it was on the 9th of May all this trouble took place and the cabinet got dissolved. And when Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed Prime Minister, as you very correctly said, he said, yes, Gotagama has to continue. So obviously he wanted the president to go, because the name itself of Gotago, that means the president has to go. So here is a Prime Minister appointed by the president coming and saying the president, chasing away president project must continue. So obviously he was part of the plan, part of the plot, or he was very supportive of that, and we know he was part of the plot now. And then when he got elected,
we should be thankful that the protesters were on the streets. If not, he wouldn't have become the president of the country.
Absolutely. Then what happened was when in July, 9th of July, when President Gotabaya left the country because of the second phase of the Aragale, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected through a due process, legal process, within the parliament. There what we challenge is not the process. The process was legal. It is as per the constitution. What we were asking, what we were objecting, some of us is, can we accept his policies? He is a man whose policies we oppose him for 2-3 decades, right? We cannot accept him as Prime Minister, as a President, but unfortunately at that time our party, which we left subsequently, accepted him.
But because of his policies, the debt restructuring process...
Not debt restructuring, all his economic policies we were against. Almost all the policies. Sale of Hambantota, right? His FCID policy, then the allegation that we were making against the central bank bond scam. There were so many reasons why we couldn't have supported him.
But Dr. Godeheva, now you remain steadfast about your decision not to support Ranil Wickremesinghe. But individual in the caliber of the Foreign Minister, Ali Sabri, has gone on record saying that Ranil Wickremesinghe is not bad as what we thought he would be. We were wrong.
So that's what is I'm sad about.
So Kanchana Wijayasekara, the Minister of Petroleum, said that they would even support the candidate of Ranil Wickremesinghe to become the next president of the country.
Yes. The question is, are they accepting his policies? For example, I mean, SLPP
Dr. Godeheva, very shortly. So isn't it his policies the reason why the IMF tranche has arrived, and isn't it why all this is looking good on the surface?
Yes, his policy. Can I explain? If you don't disturb, what was his policy to get the IMF tranche? First of all, you must remember, it is not President Ranil Wickremesinghe who went to IMF. It was President Gotabaya Rajapaksa who went to IMF. That was in March. Ranil Wickremesinghe became Prime Minister only in May. So the process had already started. It was President Gotabaya Rajapaksa who appointed the consultants for finance as well as legal. So the process had started. It was Minister Ali Sabri who was sent to IMF first, long before President Ranil Wickremesinghe became Prime Minister. So he didn't start this. So he was given a project which had already started. Then, when the IMF concluded its first staff level agreement after 1 year, I would say yes, it is because of President Ranil Wickremesinghe's policy of accepting anything that IMF says. That's a nice policy. No negotiation. Accept anything what they say. That is what exactly they've done. There were no negotiation. There were no looking at what is good for the country, right? The instructions obviously to the officers was go and accept whatever they say.
Dr. Godeheva,
so it's a very easy negotiation.
Does that have anything to do with the anti-terrorism bill that is there right now?
Obviously, that's what I started with. Now what's happening is IMF's agreement has been signed. Now it is going to be presented to it has been agreed, it has been going to be presented to the parliament very soon. And in that, what is the assumption? The general public must understand there's a huge assumption, which I would say is not going to work out. 25 billion has to be paid over the next 5 years. And they believe 14 billion out of 45 billion debt that we have to settle to the foreign creditors will be waived off during that period. That's an assumption. No one has agreed for that. People have already gone to courts. People have already sued Sri Lankan government. Already the USA courts have given leave to proceed with those things. So I would say they are not going to give this 14 billion to Sri Lanka on a platter. And then assume you can convince them to give that 14 billion. There's another condition attached to that. What is that? The condition is all creditors must be treated equally. The foreign creditors are 45 billion. Local creditors are 35 billion, 13.1 trillion Sri Lankan rupees, or 35 billion equivalent in US dollars. So when you waive off 34%, or when you are requesting them to waive off 32%, the same thing has to happen with Sri Lankan debts as well. That means your EP will be gone, your treasury bills will be gone. Yeah, so all those things will lead to riots in this country.
Yeah. So Dr. Godeheva,
that is where the
in a nutshell, just correct me if I'm wrong, let me try to summarize what you're saying in a nutshell. What you're saying is Mr. Wickremesinghe has said anything goes to the IMF. He has now got an IMF program, and now he knows that, according to you, he knows that there will be riots, there will be uprising. And he wants to pass this legislation in order to quell and suppress those uprisings.
Without any question. Without any question. Look at the definition. Look at the definition here about terrorism. What is the definition? Let me read it. I'm not a lawyer. These gentlemen know better than me. Wrongfully or unlawfully compelling the government of Sri Lanka or any other government to abstain from doing any act what is this act is talking about? I would say, isn't this the right of trade unions to protest against government when they strike, right? Then they protest when they strike, which is a legal right. They're compelling government to do something or not to do something.
So
and here that has been defined as terrorism.
So the thing is, Dr. Uday, they're branding even an ordinary citizen to be a terrorist.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Piece of
the
law.
rights that are defined in the Constitution as your fundamental rights have now been defined as terrorism.
So, Ambika,
so how should we define terrorism, Dr. Uday?
Ask the legal experts.
What is the...
There is no consensus on that internationally, but it can be, there are certain draft definitions. It can be very narrowly defined. If you really require, due to the developments in the world now, you can define it and include it as an offence in the penal code. The reason why we are saying that is that it's only a concession that I am making, that okay, if there is a new thing that has come about in the world, okay, make that an offence, but put it in the penal code, because the investigative regime is then still the criminal procedure code, right? That time tested, it has its flaws, all of that, but a lot of the
there are
rights,
greater protections.
Yeah, protections are still there. By creating a parallel regime for investigation, you are just blowing all of that out, and driving a coach through years, even say 2 centuries. Of knowledge as to how a citizen.
So, Ambika, you were one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka during the Yahapalne regime, and it's very clear that the HRCSL Act requires notification within 48 hours from the time of an arrest, offer, or a detention that takes place. However, this Act goes on to say, under the PTA, Section 33(1). It requires the HRCSL to be informed of an arrest within 72 hours.
This Act.
Yes, this bill says. So,
that's right.
why is the timing so important?
Well, I think the timing is important because you find that as soon as a person is arrested is also when the violations take place, from the fact that whether is the arrest arbitrary or not. Do they slap the person around? Do they take the person to an unauthorized place of detention? Do they tell the family where they are holding the person?
Because we saw during the Aragalaya, individuals were arrested, and the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka were notified within that 48-hour time space.
No. Well, they were not arrested during the Aragalaya. They were not arrested under the PTA. They were arrested under the penal code. But what happened there, and I was involved, that's why I know, is that they didn't tell the lawyers and even the Human Rights Commission where they were holding. Once I actually kind of live tweeted as people moved from police station to police station, and I think they found the person after they went to like 5 different places. And after about 4 or 5 hours it took us to locate the person. So that's why the timing is so important, and I think 48 hours it's too long. I would say 24 hours, but the Human Rights Commission Act says 48, but this says 72. This act is also quite insidious because it's trying to undermine the Human Rights Commission. If you look at the bill, it sets up the independent review panel.
Yes.
Now,
review.
Yes.
Article 40.
Yeah. So that is, the members are appointed by the president. So clearly we can't call it independent. That's a starting point. And one of the functions of the independent review panel is to accept complaints of allegations of violations of fundamental rights that take place when this law is implemented. Now, right now, there are 2 entities where you can go to. One is the Supreme Court, the other one is the Human Rights Commission, when a fundamental right is violated. So here they're setting up this body, but this body has the power to accept complaints, but the bill doesn't say what it does with the complaints. Can it investigate? Can it give remedies? Can it give orders? Can it give recommendations? Nothing. Instead of which there is a provision that says it must maintain confidentiality. So to me, it seems like they want to get all the complaints about violations and basically bury them. And the psyche of the families, how it would work, I would tell you, is they would think, rather than filing a fundamental rights petition in the Supreme Court, or going to the Human Rights Commission, they would think there is this body that is set up under this law. We are sure better to go here because we'll get the best remedy here. So instead of going there, they would go here, which means the other entities would not even get to know about the violations. You're not going to get Supreme Court decisions. You're not going to get Human Rights Commission recommendations. And so that, I think, is the aim. If not, why on earth would you get this body of 3 persons appointed by the president to accept these complaints, and what on earth are they supposed to do with it?
So Ms. Mandran, it's very interesting when Dr. Nala Gudeva spoke about the timing of the bill. If you look at the bills that have been tabled during Ranil Wickremesinghe's time, let's talk about the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, for an example, which has now been repealed and has been replaced with the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. But we saw the manner in which how he tried to gain more powers through the bill in question during parliamentary proceedings and so on and so forth. When you look at this bill also, it's very clear that Section 82 empowers the President to prescribe organizations on the recommendation of the Inspector General of Police or the government if the President has reasonable grounds to believe the organization is engaged in an act amounting to an offence under the proposed law. So it's very clear it's an unchecked presidency, unchecked executive.
Yeah.
He can do whatever he wants. He's just trying to muscle his power
for a year,
and he can extend it.
He can extend that.
And reasonable to whom?
Yeah, it's reasonable to him.
So no, but unchecked executive.
Of course. So this is the thing. The whole struggle last year was to abolish executive presidency, right? So what do? They do a eyewash of a 21st Amendment that doesn't change anything, but touted as something that is actually taking away executive powers. Now what are they doing? Right? Through this bill, they are strengthening the powers of the executive president, which even J.R. Jayawardena did not have.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, Mr. Sumandiran, now just imagine, now the General Secretary of the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna is saying that Basil Rajapaksa probably will be the next president of the country. So under this law, President can get a recommendation from the IGP, and if he has reasonable grounds, he can even suspend the SLPP.
Yeah, well, or the UNP, anyone,
Yeah.
I mean, any organization, right, can be prohibited. Places can be declared, public places can be prohibited places. So Golface certainly is going to be a prohibited place.
Dr. Gudeva, this is something that I can't understand. Maybe you can, since you used to be a part of that party, you can help us understand this. Is that when J.R. Jayawardena started his sort of legislative agenda after opening up, and then with the Prevention of Terrorism Act, whether it was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, whether it was the Criminal Justice Commissions or the 4th Amendment to the Constitution, he at least had some claim to legitimacy, as in he had the 5/6 majority because of the kink in the first past the post voting system. But he at least had that majority, right, in parliament. Mr. Wickremesinghe is essentially a caretaker president. His time is up in November of 2024. When you look at what he's doing, what concerns me as from the perspective of private citizen is, does this man have any intention of stepping down in November 2024? Or does he plan to pull, his uncle extended the term of parliament, will he try to extend the term of the presidency?
No money to hold the presidential election.
See, President J.R. Jayawardena and President Ranil Wickremesinghe has a lot of similarities, right? Both know how to make use of the law or manipulate the law or change the law for their benefit. When President J.R. Jayawardena, as you very correctly said, had absolute majority in the parliament, so he played with the constitution, which is the supreme law, right? He kept changing the constitution, and maybe Mr. Sumandiran might be able to help me. Out of the 17 amendments, easily good 15 or 16 were political purposes, very simple political purposes, right? He even once changed the number of members in the parliament, right?
For an elected.
So went to that extent. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, he doesn't have that 2/3 majority. Otherwise, instead of bringing these bills, he will be changing the constitution. I'm sure he will be doing the same thing that his uncle used to do. So,
my question is, how is he able to do it? Because he can only do it because of the support he's getting from the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, right?
Yes,
he's using a two-thirds majority that no longer exists in the public will.
He doesn't have two-thirds now.
So I think it's better for him than it was for J.R. Jayawardena. You see, for J.R. Jayawardena, you had 5-6 number of MPs, but each of them had won an election. They had a mandate of the people. So J.R. had to have their resignation letters in their pocket to force them to do what he wanted them to do. But for Wickremesinghe, you don't require that. These MPs have lost the mandate of the people. For them to remain in parliament, they need the president. So this is a much easier.
So I just want to ask you a question, Mr. Mandira, with regard to reconciliation. It has been always the case when it comes to reconciliation that Ranil Wickremesinghe would be able to lead Sri Lanka in that reconciliation path. What is the position of the TNA when it comes to Ranil Wickremesinghe on this respect? Because it seems to me now that you all are opposing almost everything that is being brought forward by this government. But in terms of reconciliation, where do you all stand now?
So when he wanted to fully implement the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, in November he asked us in Parliament, we said yes.
Yes, you also
but we constantly said we are skeptical about what is going to happen. Nevertheless, from our position, we will demonstrate that we will, give our full support.
Any progress?
So we did nothing, absolutely nothing so far, right? We went, but still, we went for every single meeting, so that fingers are not pointed at us, saying, "Oh, I was willing to do this," but they were not.
Mr. Sumanthiran, do you feel that his effort was genuine, or it was more of a statement to get a media circus started?
Well, I don't want to read into his mind. See, knowing Mr. Wickremesinghe as well as I do, I don't think he would have any objection to achieving, reconciliation within courts. I mean, even a sort of window dressing reconciliation. I don't think he would have any objections to that. But if it is not possible even, he will have a charade.
Because I'm like, when you look at the context that he said, Dr. Godayava said it's important to look at the motivations of this person with the legislation he's bringing, the context that he's bringing it in. Now he's bringing it in when public anger towards the government or to the political class is at an all-time high. There's a sense of solidarity amongst the public on like singular slogans. So he introduces another sort of slogan into the mix. I want the full implementation of the 13th Amendment. And then you have, it activates a certain group as well, right?
Yeah, correct. I mean, we've also had our doubts about that. Because in the last government, when a draft constitution, new constitution was brought, which went way beyond the 13th Amendment, there were no protests. Those sections that protested now didn't say anything. But this time, he kept, and we did not talk about the 13th Amendment during that time. We talked about meaningful devolution. But this time, he repeatedly used 13th Amendment as a, as a slogan, kept saying, I want to implement 13th Amendment. And it triggered off,
psychology with the country.
Yeah, it triggered off some kind of protest. So reconciliation, Shamir, is the point is, it's not something that you sort of can do in a hurry.
Yeah, you can't do it overnight, that's for sure. If you look at countries like Yugoslavia, if you look at countries like South Africa,
it's a painful process for a lot of people, a lot of sections of the community. And one must have the will to address those, to look at those wounds, and meaningfully cure them or address them. That's not present.
Now, Ms. Ampiya, when it comes
to... you can't just sort of tout that word, send 2 ministers to South Africa.
So there's a question for you
think
from...
that you are achieving reconciliation.
So there's a question for you from one of our viewers. Does Mr. Sumanthiran believe that Ranil Wickremesinghe is trying to take the international community and the people of Sri Lanka for a ride?
I don't want to answer the question of what Mr. Wickremesinghe is trying to do, but
But you can definitely say about your opposition, no?
Yeah, of course, we oppose most of what is happening at present. You see, I don't think anybody can take the people for a ride.
Not anymore.
Well, even before, you know, people are smarter than that. I would say the same for the international community, except that the international community's sole concern is not the welfare of Sri Lanka. Certainly not. Each of the countries will have their own country's welfare.
And agenda
as well. So that has to be viewed in that context. But as for the people of Sri Lanka, I mean, he might think that he is taking them for a ride, but people are never taken for a ride.
Shami, something we didn't speak about was Article 104. That is, that if I'm not mistaken, the PTA is not entirely gone. It says, notwithstanding the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, any investigation, etc., preferred will be exactly. So, in literal sense, the PTA will still haunt the anti-terrorism bill even when it is passed. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's one thing that says there that even if the criminal proceedings have not been instituted and the offence was committed, I think, before the ATA came into place, they would still prosecute under the PTA. So the problem there is, of course, the confession, because we don't have that in the ATA, and that was the most egregious provision, and that is the provision that also led to systemic torture. So for people, potentially, that could be a problem, and that could violate their, right to a fair trial, which anyway the PTA violates. But what I'm saying is, if they're saying that they took this out, there is a potential for it to continue to affect them because of that, because they have not made specific mention of it, of that particular provision.
I have a point to add to that, if I may. I know that confessions have not been used as evidence for a while, even under the PTA.
There are still cases going where they have them. The old cases, not the Easter attack, but post-2019, pre-2015 cases that are still ongoing.
Yes, the old cases.
Confessions are still
now they
used.
don't.
Yeah.
The point that I want to make is that, you see, confessions are bad, no questions about that, right? Number one objection that you have for PTA is confession, right? But when there is a confession, you can still challenge its voluntariness at the trial. Whether you succeed or not is another matter, but there is a voir dire and you can challenge the confession, whether it was given voluntarily or not. Now, with regard to this rehabilitation part, it's supposed to be somebody who surrenders. Or in this bill, you don't even have to surrender. You're taken in and the person agrees, or Attorney General withholds prosecution. If you agree to, who is to say that that agreement or that surrender is voluntary? There is no provision to ever test its voluntariness. So I would place this, very close to what the confessions did. Of course, the confessions led to a situation where the actual perpetrators, walked free, and anybody who succumbed to torture and signed a confession was made the scapegoat, and the crime was solved.
Solved.
Crime was solved. The file was closed, right? So that's why I say it was counterproductive. Terrorism, or whatever they meant by terrorism, flourished under PTA because of provisions like the confessions that were there in that law.
What are your thoughts on that, Ambika? Because section 70 and 71 speaks...
71 and 77.
71 and 77, yes, speaks about voluntarily participate in rehabilitation programs where criminal proceedings may be suspended.
You can't test it.
Or
I mean, the thing there is, of course, how can you say what the Attorney General can withhold or suspend prosecution if the person voluntarily agrees to go? There in itself, where is the voluntariness? You're saying the person has to go, this is one of the conditions, but it's voluntary. So it's rather farcical. I just find it funny. So I would say, and as I said before, we have seen historically, even, one of the persons was arrested in 2021 in that kind of mass arrest, 2020 and 2021. They tried to force the person to go to to go to rehabilitation. They actually made him call his wife so that she could convince him. She actually did not. She said, no, don't go. He did not. He was given bail and thereafter discharged, which means you clearly don't have any evidence. But if he had agreed, imagine 1 year in arbitrary detention.
Because I remember the young Nama Rajapaksa was talking about the importance of rehabilitating individuals who are involved in the Aragale. Yes. So it seems to me that these laws are somewhat interconnecting. You know, if you look at the Rehabilitation Act, certain parts that have been striked off has been brought here.
Yeah.
They spoke about media being suppressed and social media being controlled. Those aspects have been brought in this bill. So all these laws seems to be interconnecting with each other.
Absolutely, which is what I said. It's like they're constructing a web and they're doing it brick by brick, which is why even if a law does not directly impact you, like the perfect example and something I've been going on and on for months repeatedly is about the drug dependence. Because when the Supreme Court struck off everything else and left the drug dependence, everyone lost interest. No one said a thing. But hey, it is problematic because it can be used against anyone, which is why I keep saying it doesn't matter whether you think it can impact you or not, or the groups you work with. If it is oppressive, then you need to oppose it because it can be abused by the state. Sri Lankan state is very good at that, we have seen historically.
So Sri, let's talk about marginalized communities. Let's talk about the minorities in the country. We spoke about citizens being affected, but how is this piece of legislation going to impact the minority communities in the country?
So it has already impacted the minority community because the PTA. Now, this whole rehabilitation thing, I'll have to add something. So every time they take people under detention, under PTA, it's also an excuse for, because there aren't any charges, there aren't any evidence for these prolonged detention of these people. So what they are trying to do is the mistake that they have made, they are covering it up by sending them for rehabilitation, right? There is not going to be any judicial oversight. So they are covering up. They will lock up somebody for 12 months and they will say you go for voluntary rehabilitation. There is no evidence, nothing, right? So this one way of clearing what the mistake that they have done. Right? So we had to look at that. This has happened to many people under PTA, right? The poorest of the poor community, the bail condition itself is huge. Huge problem because they can't restart their livelihood. Now in August 2022, they brought in a ban list, UN designated persons list. This has been ongoing with the Tamil people in 2014 and then 2020 and 2020 to 2021. They delisted some people. 2022, there have been over 500 individuals and about 30 odd organizations that are banned. Now, many of these people, now if you look at that list, many of these people are free now. Their assets are frozen. Their bank accounts are frozen. So you take poorest of the poor people into custody by mistake, by default, and then you release them on bail. You have a severe bail condition where you can't even move from one district to other district. You have to inform the TID. And every 14 days you have to go to the police station and report. And then a couple of days before, 3.5 lakh bail. He has to pay as for the bail. Now, how would somebody collect this money when the person who is the breadwinner is in custody? Now, we have cases where, with regard to the Easter attack, a husband has been taken under the suspicion of stitching clothes for Sahara, right? And then later, the wife has been using the same sewing machine for her livelihood. TID came and took that for some test. They want to do a test in order to find out this particular sewing machine has been used for stitching clothes. So this poor woman doesn't have a livelihood and nobody looks after. There is no reparation whatsoever for these people, right? And most of the poorest of the poor people, because of the bail condition, they can't travel abroad. And people who are signing surety for them can't also travel abroad. More recently, they are asking 2 government officers to sign surety for the bail. Who will come forward? because then you are also restricted, your movement is also restricted, right? So it's extremely difficult for people, because then forever you are under surveillance. Now you have been locked up, and then you are being tortured, confession taken and all those things, and then you come out, and then your entire family, because in the north it's still operation area, so any military man can go into the house of the rehabilitated or people who are on bail. In the north there is a huge harassment, and one of my colleagues who just distributed ration because it's Ramadan to the families who have been affected by PTA has been interrogated for 9 hours and told, you are resurrecting a terrorist organization because you are distributing ration. You have to get permission of the TID director to even talk to the families, right? How would you eliminate terrorism when you do this? Because children don't have anything to eat, right? And they're dropping out of school, and their father or mother is being framed as a terrorist, and they have come out on bail, or they have been discharged, but still there is surveillance. And many of these people can't go to regular work, because wherever you are going, you are surveillance. So a mason or carpenter or a wiring person who is going to, after the bail, if they go to, who will invite them into the house? Because you are under surveillance.
Amika, I want to know, like, has there been any study or survey to see how many cases in which sort of detention, where a person has been detained or an arrest has been made or indictment has been filed, like what is the success rate of convictions under the Prevention of Terrorism Act as opposed to withdrawal of charges, acquittal, just dismissal of the case?
We actually don't have those statistics.
Didn't SSA do something?
No, not that, no. Because also I think you'd have difficulty, because there are people who are arrested but then who might be released, right? And so that would not be recorded anywhere.
And
the record would be there only if the indictment is filed. So there are various stages at which you would be able to access certain documents, certain not. And as far as I know, that it's probably like a multi-year study that you would have to do.
Multi-decade study.
Decade study.
From 79 to 29.
Yeah, but just to go back to Shamir's question about how can it affect minorities, I'll give you a great example about what's happening now in the north and the east, is that we have seen a spate and a very planned destruction of Hindu temples and constructing Buddhist temples in their place. Now, people who have protested this, who although they did not damage the newly constructed Buddhist site a few months ago, they were arrested, allegedly because they damaged it, but of course they were released because there was no evidence of them having damaged it. Now again, some were arrested about 1 week ago. Now under this law, causing damage or destroying a place, a religious or cultural place, is an offense. If you do it with the intention of inciting hatred, violence or discrimination against a community, that would constitute a terrorist offense. So they can say that the protesters damaged that Kurundur Malai in Mullaitivu, the newly constructed Buddhist temple. They did it with the intention of inciting hatred and violence against the Buddhist people, and therefore it's an act of terrorism. They can make Kurundur Malai a prohibited place. If they do, well then no journalist can go there, no activist can go there. They would immediately say, well, this is a violation and this is an offense under this law. If you gather information at that place, that can constitute confidential information because that place is a prohibited place, and in which case, once again, you're committing an offense under the law. So this is how it can affect people in the north and the east.
Dr. Godeheva, on this issue, I mean, one of the things that we have, like, we see the anti-terrorism legislation also proposing that that military personnel can perform arrests of civilians. And you have to admit that the presence of the military is disproportionately higher in the north and east, and in the northwest as well. In that context, do you feel that people's sort of fundamental right to be treated equally before the law is being violated? And do you feel that do you believe that the military should be given this kind of power to arrest civilians?
Why is there police force in the country? Why not only military? The military is to be called for when there's a war. or an emergency situation. Otherwise, it is the police which has to deal with the civilians. So if you are going to bring the military people into this, that is definitely, that's something not acceptable.
You feel that this should be handled entirely by the police?
Definitely, definitely.
Dr. Gudeva, there has never been a point in the Sri Lankan history, at least not that I can recollect, that 224 members of Parliament have voted in favor of a bill or an act for a bill in Parliament. There has always been opposing parties. So even if you're talking about the bill in question, the anti-terrorism bill, there are going to be parties, there are going to be individuals who are against this bill. So let's talk about how to redraft this bill for the benefit of the government and for the benefit of the people as well. So if this bill has to be redrafted, if this bill has to be put into the public domain, brought in as a blueprint, and then we work on it together, what changes do you want?
That's a tough question for me, because there were so many things that we have challenged. No, I would say, first of all, from a very with limited legal knowledge, I would say the definition of terrorism has to be relooked at.
Narrowed down.
It has to be narrowed down, because now there's a good discussion that is coming up. Most of these things can be adapted in the penal code. If you need a separate bill for terrorism, let's narrow it down for specifics, right? So I think that's the most important thing here.
Yeah, because Dr. Gudeva, this is one of the requirements of the GSP Plus team as well, saying it's very important to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act. If you look at it, then Minister, now Minister also, for Ali Sabri, had clearly articulated and pledged to the EU delegation that the PTA would be repealed with a piece of legislation. So that piece of legislation is the anti-terrorism bill. That's clear, Dr. Gudeva. So there is no way out. We have to bring in a bill. So what should this bill entail?
No, I think this bill also, in my opinion, has to go through a proper public consultation, because it hasn't happened. So only a technical committee which has looked into that. There are a lot of discussion that people like you, media is initiating. I think only through a proper public discussion we will know what should be the perfect bill. You know, no, I will not be able to comment on all. But I mentioned one thing I see is the narrowing down of the definition.
So, Mr. Mandhir, what is you're also a lawyer. You're a president's counsel. So, what would you want to be striked out of the bill? Now, don't say I want the entire bill to be
I want the entire bill out.
Exactly.
But if there should be a replacement, what must that replacement
the introduction
be?
of a offence called terrorism into the penal code. That's all. That's only. It's only to that extent that I will concede, because having lived with the PTA and having had lots of experience with the PTA. And I have said this on the show as well, that it has been counterproductive. It has encouraged terrorism. Why would anyone want another piece of legislation to further acts of terrorism? So I don't think we should have a parallel regime of investigation of terrorist offences. If at all, there must be a separate, very narrowly defined offence called terrorism under the normal investigative regime.
Shreen, what are your thoughts?
To begin with, I talked about it. We don't want.
We don't need a bill.
We don't need ATA. We need moratorium on PTA, because government said moratorium and still arrested 3 students. And to relook at the penal code and see what they can do. And there are good practices, international good practices. And something that they have to do is, they don't have to rush through this. They have to have consultation with victim communities. Because PTA has affected ethnic minorities and religious minorities. And this discussion has to go to them, and we have to come up with something in consultation with different sections of the community, including the Aragalaya activists.
Ambika, what are your thoughts? Because I saw an article which read out saying the good, the bad and the ugly. So let's strike off the bad and the ugly and let's keep the good as far as the bill is concerned. Is that your thought? Or?
I would say, you know what, firstly the drafting process. Even during Yahapalana, someone who was part of the drafting process told me that the military they were the kind of majority stakeholder there, and they were the ones driving the process, and this person had a lot of difficulty just ensuring even the basics were included. So even if you're talking about consultation, who do you consult with? I think you also need to be honest with the public about who you consult with. You can't have 90% or 75% military driving it and then you say you've had consultation, the people don't know, and you've not talked to, for instance, human rights activists, experts, or the families. Secondly, you know, this is not rocket science, astrophysics or whatever, because all these principles are already laid down in conventions. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights while Countering Terrorism has published report after report. There are standards, there are good practices. So this is not brain surgery, right? If you haven't done it, it means you don't care and you do not intend to do it. If there is political will, they can easily do that. And I would say even the PTA doesn't create new offenses. What it does is it gives excessive, arbitrary, abusive powers to law enforcement. What does this law do? Exactly that, abusive, arbitrary, broad powers to law enforcement and now the military. But in addition to which, we've got another additional element, which is extremely broad definition of terrorism, which means they can nab anyone and everyone. So yes, this is 500% worse than the PTA, and I would say I would agree with them. What we need is to have a new offense, but you do need to have all the protections. You can't give police excessive powers. You cannot bring the military into it. You need to have proper judicial oversight. You can't use the judiciary as a rubber stamping entity.
So it's clear, Mr. Mandiran, that Vijayadas Rajapaksa is going to be tabling this bill.
I don't know whether he's going to do that. I mean, he started off rather aggressively saying that those who oppose ATA are persons who want to commit terrorist offences. He has toned that down now slightly. So, I mean, he knows what this is all about.
But certain political parties are of the view that the bill is good. Why is the TNA having a different view?
Because we represent the people of this country who were worst affected by the PTA for 4 decades or more. Right? We've lived with this terrible piece that affected our youth, everyone, and so we'll be the first ones to oppose it. You might recall last year we had a campaign right through the country to repeal the PTA. We went to all 25 districts. A mobile campaign, a separate mobile campaign we did for 23 days, and we had support from every single district. We had support. Not one single person anywhere told us, no, we need the PTA, what are you all doing? We stood at bus stands, we stood at markets in the south, right? Everybody supported the repeal, because by that time, even people in the south it has started affecting them. So we will be at the forefront of opposing this legislation. Those who are saying blithely that you need this and you need that, I listened to one of those 2 comments. I mean, just laughable. I don't think they've read this piece of legislation. I don't think they know what PTA has done to this country.
Yeah, so how is this going to affect the country's economy, Dr. Godeva? Because this is one of the calls of the EU, which is providing us the GSP plus concessions. We saw the manner in which how Sri Lanka lost a big portion of fish exports to the EU because of the non-availability of the GSP plus concession. Do you think that this will really drag us down, because right now the country is in dire need of foreign exchange?
See, I think rather than looking at specifically what the international community will look at this bill and say, we must look at the big picture. I think the big picture is very alarming, because the country's economy is a subject that has to be discussed continuously, because it is evolving. There are a lot of problems, a lot of things that people perceive as good. As I mentioned, when you go into deep, there are a lot of big issues. So if you try to suppress those discussions using a bill like this, The suppression is never going to solve the problem. It will only going to blow up at a particular time.
So let's say, Dr. Gudeheva, this is brought to Parliament. I want to pose this question to Mr. Sumandran and Mr. Gudeheva. Dr. Gudeheva. Dr. Gudeheva, let's say this is tabled on the 25th of April. What would be the next course of action?
We will definitely oppose that.
Okay. No, they'll 2 weeks time to challenge it in the Supreme Court, so that process will go through, and then we don't know what the Supreme Court will say. If it says that certain provisions need a referendum in addition to a 2/3, then the government will have to make some, obviously drop those. If it says you need 2/3 for some provisions, whether the government can muster 2/3, we don't know. So all that is out.
In Parliament, it is a numbers game at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right.
Unless the Supreme Court says you need the 2/3. So if for the bill
so it's a sad day when we are discussing that the EU GSP Plus is what determines what is good for the citizen.
Absolutely.
It shouldn't be. It's a very sad thing. Right? Now, I'll give you an example. When CTA was being discussed, confessions was not a problem for the EU, because the civil law countries, they have confessions. Confessions.
Lawyer can be present.
Sorry?
Lawyer can be present. They have.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So we had to show, the different legal regime, and the culture here and so on, and then they accept it. But why do we have to go and convince Europeans what is good and what is bad
for us?
For us, it should be done here. So, but this is how, this is a state to which we have been brought, rather than look at what is right, what is good for the ordinary people of the country. And with an experience of PTA for 4 decades, everyone accepts that it has been abused. No one says, no, it has not been abused. Everyone knows what confessions.
So, Mr.
You ask the leader of the House, Susil Premajand. Every time he stands up to speak about this, he talks about the time that he appeared for PTA suspects, right? And that what confessions did. Everyone knows that, right? But when they are in office, when they are in power, and they want the military and the defense establishment to protect them in office, they listen to them. Now, even the rehabilitation, the truth and reconciliation, now they talk about something.
Concept.
Not concept, they have drafted the law, right? Now, there is consultation apparently. Where is the consultation? The Attorney General is consulted, and he is now whittling a lot of those things down. Next, it's going to the Defense Ministry. Lo and behold, to the Defense Ministry on truth, on ascertaining the truth as to what happened at the last stages of the war. I mean, including that. It's much broader than that. But no consultation with the people. No reconciliation project will ever succeed if the victim community doesn't accept it. That is the crux of the matter. It must be victim-centered, not perpetrator-centered. So you consult the perpetrators, and then you bring a law to Parliament. So this is what is happening. ATA is no different.
May I make a point regarding, something to follow on from what Mr. Sumandran said, is particularly after the end of the war, that's the irony of it. In Sri Lanka, after the end of the war, and the Rajapaksas started this, is the militarization of everything, and the role given to the military, unlike even in the past. And that has, I think, eroded checks and balances of what should exist in a healthy democracy. We see the military running businesses, we see the military getting involved in all sorts of
and it has failed also. If you look at the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, most of the establishments were given to the military.
Exactly.
And that process completely failed, and it's proven.
They run massive farms in the north, they undercut the local farmers, etc. They engage in surveillance, monitoring of civil society, of activists, of journalists. So that is a problem, and I think that is also the invisible hand. Many people don't know that the role that they play in the drafting of legislation. So I think people need to be concerned about that. They might think
Are you trying to say, Ambika, even this piece of legislation has the hallmark of the military being involved?
Yeah, must have been consulted, yes.
Well, the point is this, it's about 80-85% CTA, and I know that the military was heavily involved with the drafting of the CTA and drove it, so, yeah, I mean, clearly.
No, but what is the way forward, Mr. Mandran? Now, there has to be a way out. This is going to be tabled in Parliament. The government is not going to, put this under the carpet or not talk about it anymore. They will definitely bring forth this piece of legislation based on what Vijay Rajapaksa said a few days ago in the media, saying it's going to be tabled in Parliament on the 25th of April.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they will do.
So are you saying that you have doubts that they wouldn't bring this to Parliament?
Yeah, not on the 25th. You know, they might delay it, or they may table it. I don't know what they're going to do. But you know, you asked the question, what's the way forward? The way forward is to be genuine in what you want to do. If you're talking about reconciliation, you must be genuine in what you are trying to do. If you've given a promise to repeal the PTA, you repeal the PTA, not bring it the same things under another name, right? So that is where you start. You can't continue to have this kind of charade and hope that the country can move forward. You know, economic issues are important, but so are, you know, governance issues. They're all interconnected. You can't separate all of these.
Right? Governance should be the core, as far as the government is concerned.
So, so long as you do this kind of thing to protect yourself, to remain in power, you will never succeed. Country will never go forward.
Dr. Godaheva, based on what Mr. Sumandran was saying on governance and what Ms. Satyanathan was saying on the role of the military, and when you look at what's there in the legislation now as well, bringing in the military to fill in what should be done by law enforcement, as you said, with the police, it looks like although the president said that the government has no business being in business, he's perfectly happy allowing the military to do all of those things.
Definitely. But the military is in business.
The military is in business.
I'll give you one example.
The military is also in police. The military is also in everything.
On the 16th of January, President Ranil Wickremesinghe.
That you did purposely.
Well, it's a Ranil Rajapaksa government.
Yeah.
But Ranil Wickremesinghe came to Jaffna and had a discussion with all of us with regard to releasing the balanced lands that are still in under military occupancy. There is a strip of land east of Paladi Road, right? It doesn't interfere with anything, but it's red soil, and the military is cultivating, growing vegetables, and add insult to injury, selling it to the owners of that land and undercutting other farmers.
Yeah.
Right? 116 families can be resettled in that place. The only discussion that was possible that day was, oh, let's start with allowing them also to cultivate. So
the operative word being also.
Also.
Yeah.
But it doesn't even happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't even happen.
So we're talking about intentions as far as the government is concerned. Dr. Godaheva, what is the position of the Freedom People's Front on this bill?
As I mentioned earlier, I think, or we think, a bill of this nature has to be exposed for greater public consultation. We must educate the people as much as possible of the great dangers involved in this.
Right.
So we will try to do that, and because even in the parliament, most of the people have misunderstood it. If you listen to most of the government MPs, they think this is a bill that has been brought to control the next Aragale.
So we are going to close the discussion.
So they've understood it properly.
No, they don't understand when they try to use it, what will happen next.
Exactly.
There will be 1,000 Aragales will start because of this. This is something that they don't understand.
Yeah.
We spoke today about the anti-terrorism bill, but I want to ask Dr. Godaheva one question of the subject, if I may. And if you may, if you want to respond, you could respond. Dr. Godaheva, I've been trying to figure out who is the leader of your movement, the Freedom People's Front.
We are not a party.
I'm trying to figure out, because at one point, Dala Salah Perumal seemed to be the candidate who was your nominee for the post of leadership. I'm trying to figure out now. I'm asking you this question. If you don't want to respond, if you don't want to respond, it's totally fine, because I thought, because you're here today, I'm just going to ask this question for the benefit of our viewers. Who is really taking leadership of the party?
Thank you for asking that question, because that will give you an opportunity to explain what it is, even though this is outside this subject. See, after President Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected by majority LPP and with others 134 members of the parliament, and after the emergency debate, 13 of us left the party and became independent. We are not a political party. We are a group within SLPP, but acting independently, as you asked earlier. So we are independently voting for a bill based on our conscience. Not going.
So there is no leadership.
There's no. I'm not strictly going by a party structure anymore. So there's no leadership. It's a group. The most senior members are Professor G.L. Piris and Mr. Dala Salah Perumal. So they take kind of front because the seniority there.
So if there is an election, a presidential election that everyone is talking about, they say that the first election that we probably have is a presidential election. Who would be the candidate that you would support?
Too early to say that, no? We will support the right candidate, whoever is at that time.
Right now there is none.
The worry is that there may not be any right candidate
at the moment
for the people
Does that mean that you won't support a left candidate?
So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. M.S. Sumandran, President's Council and Member of Parliament representing TNA, for joining us this evening on the show. Dr. Nala Gudeheva, Member of Parliament from the Freedom People's Front. Thank you very much, Dr. Gudeheva, for joining us this evening on the show. Shreen Abdul Sarur, activist, and also Ambika Satkaranathan, former Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. I think it's important to have such discourse, at least off the government record, because the public should be aware of what's going on in the country. And thank you very much for participating in this discussion despite your demanding schedules. I think it's very important to keep the people aware. Tomorrow is a holiday, and today being here on the show, I really appreciate it for being on the show, gentlemen and the ladies. Thank you very much, Nadim. Thank you very much, Sandra, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Good governance with good intentions is the hallmark of any government. Implementation with integrity should be the core passion. Take care and good night.